Sometimes our knowledge about climate change can be narrow, mostly focused on our areas of work or interest. But this issue that cuts across themes and disciplines requires holistic understanding of science, politics, technology to have a sound opinion and to increase the synergies for climate action. And one such attempt has been made by a newly launched book, Backstage Climate, which acts as a primer on this pressing issue and tries to demystify what climate change is and its importance across disciplines. And to discuss this book with us today, we have its author, Mr. Rajan Mehta, who is recognized as a serial tech entrepreneur and has worked in companies like Motorola and Nortel. He recently concluded his fellowship from Harvard, focusing on climate change and circular economy. Join us today as we pick up nuggets from the book and discuss issues including climate adaptation, war and climate change, energy solutions including nuclear fusion, and most importantly, steps that you and I can take to mitigate this crisis. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me today, and heartiest congratulations for your new book.
Thank you.
Sir, can we begin this conversation by first having a brief overview of the book, and maybe if you could share what motivated you to write it?
Sure. Actually, the book is a broad sweep on climate change. You know, it talks about the science behind it, the politics behind it, and the economics behind it. It also goes on to suggest some technology solution, some nature-based solutions, and also a policy framework which could help address this issue. Uh, and to your point of really what motivated me to write this book was it wasn't as much of a motivation as a compulsion I felt because climate change is real. We are seeing nature ringing its alarm bells every so often, and by way of floods and droughts and excessive rainfalls and sea level rising, that it is alarming. Uh, Yet, the issue of climate change wasn't taking a center stage, right? So the whole idea of this book was to bring this issue center stage, right? And take it to our dining tables so that people like you and me, we start talking about it. And the awareness increases because once the awareness increases, change will follow. And the other thing I felt was, you know, uh, when I decided to write this book, I went and met some scientists, thinking that they will know a lot, and they did, right? But they were very conversant and very knowledgeable about the aspect of science that they were dealing with, but nothing beyond that. And then I went to meet some politicians and some economists. The politicians understood the power structures very well, how the society works, right? The economists understood the flow of wealth very well, but not the science of climate change. So my idea was that we needed to break these silos, bring all of these people together, give them an understanding of what climate change is and how solutions will work. Because ultimately, you know, uh, it's not just the distribution of carbon that determines climate change. It's also the distribution of wealth and power that will bring around the change. So those are the things that I wanted to bring together through this book. You know,
And I think you've done a great job.
thank you.
I enjoyed a lot of mythological references that were there in the book, and particularly the one being where the god calls on Noah to
Yeah,
build this ark to protect everyone from the impending flood. Not to refer a lot of other mythological references, but I really enjoyed that reference as a starting point for talking about a lot of adaptation measures. As we know that India is also at a center wherein we are experiencing so much climate change effects, and adaptation happens to be one of the very pivotal concerns. Could you touch upon adaptation measures that you've discussed in the book a little bit more?
Sure, but before that, I'd like to talk a little bit about, you know, as we fight climate change, there are three sequential bullets in our arsenal. Those are mitigation, which means reduction of the emissions from their source. Then there's adaptation, which means getting ready to uh, address or live with any consequences or to prepare ourselves to from harm's way as kind of climate change shows its wrath to us. And the third is loss and damage, right? If we invest in mitigation, then the need for adaptation reduces. And if we invest in adaptation, then the need for loss and damage reduces. And if we invest in loss and damage, then the human suffering reduces. And that's our ultimate objective, to reduce human suffering. So, therefore, adaptation becomes very important, especially for developing countries, because developed countries have the technology, the money, the systems, so that, God forbid, if any disaster strikes, they're able to take care of it, whereas developing countries can't. So you see this tussle between the developed world and the developing world. Developed world wants to focus on mitigation, whereas the developing world is saying, my people are suffering, our people are suffering, so we first need adaptation, right? So having said that, uh, the need for adaptation comes from what could be the ill effects of climate change, right? Because whatever could be the ill effect, we need to start preparing ourselves to adapt against those consequences. So let's look at what could be the consequences of climate change and therefore what adaptation we need.
Yeah.
So the first consequence of climate change is that our livable space is likely to shrink, right? Because as the sea rises, the habitable land will reduce. On the other hand, desertification is happening. Land is turning arid, so that's kind of reducing. So migrations will happen, right? So the first thing that, as part of adaptation, we need to think that if migrations are going to happen, then we need to prepare ourselves for it, right? Because if you see historically, whenever there's been a mass migration, there's always been a war, right? So we need to kind of prepare ourselves for that, not only domestically, but also internationally, because God forbid if some countries go down, then those people need to shift somewhere to live. And unless there are international treaties, alliances, it'll be a big problem. So I think that's one part of adaptation, and I'd like to give you an example here. There's a country in the Polynesian region called Kiribati. It's a small island state, 34,000 population, and in most likelihood, that may be the first nation to go underwater, right? And these people know it, right? And what they've done recently is they've taken 20 square kilometers of land in Fiji, and they're migrating half their population there, right? And for the other half, they had been going to various countries and requesting if they could allow their people to emigrate there, right? So that's an example of adaptation, right? This is the first one. The second one is there will be infrastructural damage, right? As floods happen, sea level rises, all these things. So we need to prepare ourselves for that. You'll see in many coastal areas and flood prone areas, people have now started building houses, or they're building on stilts so that, flood waters don't come in. I don't know if you would remember, you may have been very young at that time. There was a very strong uh, storm that hit New York in 2012 called Storm Sandy, I think. And the whole city went dark because there was no power, right? Only one building stood kind of shining there in the night, and that was the Golden Sachs building. And it did so because their engineers or whoever built that had the foresight to put up the power backup equipment on the second floor rather than in the basement. All other buildings had it in the basement and they got flooded and power went off because they had the foresight, keeping climate change and its repercussions in mind, and kept it on the second floor. Nothing happened to the power, right? That's an example in adaptation again. The other effect of climate change could be, see, as migrations happen, it's not only humans who will migrate, it's animals also who will migrate, right? And what will happen is the proximity between the men or the humans and the animals will increase. And there are diseases called as zoonotic diseases, which transfer from animals to men, right? The incidence of those will increase. In fact, there are certain animals, these are called reservoir hosts, and they have pathogens which are believed that they haven't crossed over to the humans as yet. Now, if the proximity increases, the incidence of disease increases. Therefore, we need to start preparing for it. Coronavirus, by all means, could have been, one of such climate change kind of outbursts. So, when we say we need to prepare for it, means we need to start preparing for vaccines for pathogens that may come, right? We need to start, you know, beefing up our medical facilities, our public health system, right? In preparation or in readiness for anything coming out of these migrations, right? Then, as climate change kind of strikes us, it's not only heat that will increase, it's also humidity, right? And the combination between heat and humidity is deadly. It gives rise to a lot of, mosquitoes, leeches, all these will have a ball. And with that, vector-bound diseases increase, right? So we need to start preparing for that. How do we control the spread of vectors? How do we, in the case people do get dengue and malaria and chikungunya and all these things, or Lyme's disease, how do we take care of it, right? So from a medical point of view, health point of view, we need to start adapting. Even for mental health, I gave you the example of Kiribati. Think of the mental state of people there who don't know when their homes are going to sink, you know, the incidence of accidents, right? So we need to build our medical facilities. In fact, there's a place in Mongolia which is very flood prone. So what people have done there is they built their medical centers and food storage places on floating wooden, bases. So when the flood waters come, this whole structure rises up, and when it goes down. So that's again adaptation at work. People are very ingenious, even at the local levels there, right? So I spoke about adaptation for migration, adaptation for infrastructure, adaptation for health. The other important thing is food, the food systems. So climate change will affect them. Not only will floods destroy our crops, the heat will destroy our crops, and there are likely to be new pathogens that come, right, which will destroy them, right? So we need to start preparing for food varieties of our seeds that can resist droughts and that can resist floods, and work is happening on that. FAO is, or the Food and Agricultural Organization, is coordinating that to make sure that we don't go. Also, food storage facilities not only need to be increased, but they need to be re-engineered and reconfigured so that floods and heat don't come and destroy it. So I think, broadly speaking, these four things, if we take care of from an adaptation point of view, at least we would have made a good start. I hope that gives you an idea.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And sir, I think The book also happens to touch a lot on those issues which are often missed out of our mainstream discussion when it comes to climate change. For example, war and its effect on environment. We are seeing right now the situation in the world and in the pockets where the war is taking place. And somehow governments also refrain from talking about war's effect on climate change. But I think your book picks it up and does justice to the issue. Would you want to take some time and talk about that?
I can try. Yeah. So, you know, war or conflict of any kind um, is not good, right? Uh, when it comes to climate change, military operations are said to contribute around 5.5% of the total greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? Uh, and this doesn't happen just during the period of the war.
Yeah.
The preparation for war, the peacetime exercises that the armies do, right? The fire and fury during the war, and then most of it in the rebuilding that needs to take place after the war, because a lot of buildings have to be reconstructed, re-erected, and a lot of material goes into that, and this material is very, very high in its carbon footprint, right? I'm not going to go too much into the morality of war, but briefly, any conflict, uh, whether it's between siblings or between members of the society or nation, there are established ways of addressing it. In a family, when children are fighting, the elders come in and settle it. In a nation, there is the judicial system. There's a system of courts where you go to, and there is a system they follow uh, to adjudicate on the issue. Same thing happens at the international level also. There is the WTO. There's the Tribunal on Sea Laws and many others, right? Uh, and what happens is there is a system of uh, uh, punishment and a fine, right? That takes care of it, right? And any law abiding citizen will follow that and respect it and go with the judgment, right? Now, even when it comes to countries, and especially conflict ridden countries, if they have two neighbors have dispute, uh, ideally the UN system should be able to address that. And when I say the UN system, there's a trinity of the Office of the Secretary General, who's supposed to be the voice of reason, the International Court of Justice, which is the adjudicator, and the Security Council, which is the final peacekeeper, that if somebody is not listening, then it can step in, right? But the system seems to be weakened somehow. It's not kind of living up to what it was supposed to do. So either it needs to be strengthened, or uh, an alternate platform needs to be created, which is strong enough to be able to prevail on various states, right? And I think that's an urgent issue to be taken up in the world. Uh, I'm not sure if anything is happening on that, but I think it needs to be pressed upon, right? Now, in addition to that, we also need to have some tools in our arsenal, to be able to provide justice or to avoid a conflict. Like, as I said, in the arena of courts, there's a fine and there's a punishment, right? Uh, in the international arena, uh, I I would like to suggest that there be a carbon tax on war, right? And the reason I'm saying it is because if you really see, nature was created equal for everyone, right? Therefore, nobody has the right to spoil the nature in a manner that it adversely affects somebody else. And war exactly does that. Two nations are fighting over their egos, and you and me sitting here are suffering because of global warming. We are losing our livelihood, we are losing our health. There's no reason that that should be allowed to happen. So, what I'm suggesting is because war leads to emissions and addition of carbon dioxide, right? I'm suggesting that there be a carbon tax on war, right? So that it acts like a deterrent, right? People know that, if they get into this act of war, then they will have to pay in addition to whatever losses they suffer. And maybe it acts as a deterrent. And well, I'm not an expert on taxes and how they should be applied, but I would say that, either manufacturers of ammunition need to be taxed at the source, right? Or countries selling weapons need to be taxed, or countries buying need to be taxed, or when there is an act of war, a mechanism needs to be worked out. In either case, this tax should go into a common fund, right, which helps address climate change, right? So that first it acts as a deterrent, and second, even if it happens, then at least you're using that pool of money to address climate change. So that was the idea.
Now, sir, talking about the solutions that can move the needle, and I think you talk a lot about some of the solutions that are working and some of the solutions that have a lot of merit which can scale and help in fighting climate change. Would you want to discuss one of these solutions that you are most looking forward to or you are most excited about, which you talk in the book as well?
Sure. See, the again, we must always look at which source has the most detrimental effect on climate. And if we can do something about it, uh, then we'll all be happy, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is to go after the big guys, the big culprits. And today, the biggest culprit is energy. Even today, 70% of our energy is coming from thermal power. And if I don't mess up my calculation, it should be putting anywhere close to, you know, 30 to 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalents into the atmosphere. It's a huge amount, right? And this need for energy will only increase, right? Uh, it's great we are working towards renewable power. Solar and wind have taken center stage, and today, in many cases, they are even cheaper than the thermal power. Uh, but they have limitations. The sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and they also, as they go through their cycles, uh, they will create a lot of waste, right? Solar panels and
Yeah.
windmills, and they have a lot of carbon footprint, right? And also, they need land, and we aren't making any more land, right? So at some future point in time, there will be limitations to it, right? Uh, I know nuclear is a bad word right now, ever since Fukushima, but there are some people who've been constantly, silently, you know, working on nuclear energy, right? And trying to make it cheaper, safer, scalable, right? Uh, so in nuclear, so far we've been using nuclear fission technology, which is we take an atom and we split it, and the mass of the two atoms, or you know, is lesser than the mass of the original, and therefore that additional mass is converted into energy. The challenge with fission based
I'm there, sir. I think your recording stopped in between.
is it okay now? Is it
Yes,
recording now?
I think it's okay. Yeah. Yes.
I'm sorry. So
No worries.
uh, the problem with fission is that you know, you're bombarding neutrons onto atoms. And these neutrons go and split the atoms. More neutrons are released. Those neutrons again go and split atoms. So it gets into a chain reaction, which becomes very difficult to control. And therefore, disasters happen. Right? While work is happening to make it safer and, smaller modules, I'll not talk about that in this. There is another form of nuclear that is, uh, you know, uh, kind of peeping from the horizon, right? That's nuclear fusion. In nuclear fusion, you take two atoms and fuse them together, and the mass of the combined atom is lesser than the two, so that additional mass is converted into energy. That is how sun generates its energy. So we're trying to now mimic it and see if we can use fusion energy, right? Uh, Work has been happening on that for probably 40, 50 years, right? It may take another couple of decades, uh, but I think as it happens, that will solve some of our or most of our energy issues. And there is good news around there that 2 years back at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in Berkeley, US, the first time ever they were able to uh, conduct a positive experiment, which means they took two uh, atoms and fused them together. And the amount of energy that was required to fuse them together was less than the amount of energy released after they were fused together, which means it demonstrated that additional energy can be generated. So that's been a big leg up for this sector, and a lot of players are pouring in a lot of money into it right now and betting that that becomes the energy solution for the future. Yeah.
And so, while we talk about climate communications, one thing that come out, I guess, there's ubiquitous acceptance of this idea that once we give people with the actionable items, the problem feels less daunting. And I think in the book you give actionable items from A to Z, which I think is very interesting because once someone understands what the problem is, they can see that they can contribute in solving the problem while they are doing one of these A to Z acts that you mentioned in the book. Would you want to take some time and just talk about a few?
I won't bore the audience and you with the A to Z of it, but broadly speaking, I'll just mention two or three of them. I think the most important uh, thing that we as ordinary citizens can do is to use the power of our votes and our wallets, right? Uh, See, we all have to participate in this change that is required to save the climate crisis. But individual efforts have limitations, and if you want to bring around a mass transformation, then governments and policy have to step in, right? And governments and politicians do not act till the public pressure is there. So that tool in our hands to create public pressure is very important. And the best way we can demonstrate that is through our votes, right? Voting for parties which are conscientious about the environment, care about climate, and uh, you know, have it in their manifesto and are serious about doing something, right? If we kind of let it be known to them that climate is important for us, and this is an issue we will consider while voting, I think you will see change happening, and this is required worldwide, right? I'm not talking about India; it's worldwide, right? The second is through our wallets. Same phenomenon happens with companies, right? If you start putting your money to buy products which are environmentally friendly, which are climate friendly, you know, those companies will start doing better. They will increase their production. With increase in production, their prices will come down. That will fuel the market further, bringing around a change. But if we continue to buy products which are not so climate friendly, maybe a tad cheaper, uh, it will lead us in the wrong direction. So I would say, you know, votes and wallets is the most important thing. In addition to that, you know, overconsumption is a big spoiler for climate. Be it anything, be it clothes, be it even food that we waste, be it the extra cars that we want to, drive, be it extra travel. If we can control our consumption, at least for some time till we are able to get this monster in control, uh, that will certainly help. So I just leave with these three things. I think if we do these, we should start seeing change, and of course, many others as well.
Yeah. So you conclude the book by saying that we are riding a tiger and we must outlast it. And I think it perfectly summarizes the situation. But as a closing question, I just want to know that how hopeful are you when we talk about how are we riding the tiger and can we really outlast it?
I'm very optimistic, actually, uh, and I'm optimistic uh, with you know, the world has faced similar situations earlier as well. In 1950s, 60s, everyone was talking, or many people were talking, that world will run out of food because population was increasing exponentially, whereas food was growing linearly. But the moment these alarm bells rang, our scientists, technologists, policymakers, farmers, people all started kind of working towards it. We had the Green Revolution, and today we have excess food. So human ingenuity is such that when we have a challenge, uh, I have no doubt that we have the capability to handle it. But all of us need to play our part, right? If we as citizens don't play our part and don't do things which are climate friendly, then of course no one can help us. If the governments don't do what they're supposed to do, no, we are doomed. If the companies don't do, so as long as all of us march in the same direction with the goal in mind, there's no doubt in my mind that we will, overcome this situation. Definitely, the challenge becomes we are constantly tinkering with nature, right? Uh, so even when we solve this issue, what are going to be the unknown consequences of the acts we undertake? We don't know. So we always have to be ready and keep our eyes on the ground. What is the next problem we've created, and start solving for that as well. So we'll have to be awake all the time.
And any last thoughts before we conclude this call, sir?
No, I think that's about it. We should stay optimistic, stay hopeful, but not lose our take off our eye from the ball. I think that's important. That if we do our part, we'll be fine.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. I think the book encapsulates a lot of interesting anecdotes, stories, examples, and I think from which everyone can benefit. Certainly, I did. So, I hope more and more readers buy it. And thank you so much for generously sharing your insights with us
You're
today.
very welcome, and I enjoyed talking to you. Bye,
Thank
Anirudh.
you, sir.
Thank you.